Hi, welcome back. In this section, we're going to start learning about epithelial tissue, or as it's sometimes called, epithelium. And when we are learning about epithelium, first we have to understand what it is. And what it is a sheet of cells that covers and protects every surface in your body. On the outside of your body, that's epithelium. On the inside of your body, inside your nose, inside your mouth, inside your stomach, inside your uterus, inside your airways, inside your blood vessel, inside your heart, on the outside surface of your heart, on the outside surface of your stomach, on the outside surface of your intestine. It lines all cavities, it lines all blood vessels inside and outside. It forms your glands. All the tubes, all the ducts are all lined by epithelium. So on a surface, it could look like this picture here on the left. You can always tell if there is a surface, like here on the left, that has to be epithelium. Or here on the right, this is a duct because you can see the surface in the middle, which means this part is epithelium, and this is epithelium, and this is epithelium, and this is epithelium. Because basically, think of it a surface like this, and you've cut it. And so you're looking at the opening there in the middle. Um, Epithelium is unique in that it is avascular, which means it does not have a blood supply. So in other words, right below the epithelium, there's usually a lot of little blood vessels, lots of capillaries right around here, because nutrients need to diffuse up into the epithelium. So if the epithelium is very thick, like skin is, the cells near the bottom have lots of nutrients, and the further away you get, the less nutrients, and so the surface cells are dead. However, unlike other tissues which are avascular, think your cartilage, epithelium has a nerve supply. So yes, if you cut epithelium, we have pain fibers. It also can have heat sensors. There's lots of different types of sensory input we can get here. The other really cool thing about epithelium, it has a very rapid cell turnover. It can be as quick as a week. And most places, epithelium turns over in at least 10 days or 2 weeks turnover. The other thing, I don't know if you've noticed by looking at it, it is just packed cell next to 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 cell. Notice no matrix. It's just sheets of cells. Totally the opposite of connective tissue. Okay. And so these cells have various jobs. They can form protection. Epithelium always is protection, forming a barrier, trying to keep the outside environment separate from the inside environment. And yet it can let certain things going through depending on what type of epithelium it is. Some epithelium secrete stuff. And you know that because you get the drippy nose, and some absorbs. You know that if you've ever had a nicotine patch or a birth control patch, it's absorbing the chemicals in those patches. Now, epithelium is not just something that's sitting on top of something else and we can just peel it off. It has to be anchored to the underlying tissue. So it's just like a house in most parts of the country have to be anchored to the underlying ground by a basement. The epithelium is anchored to the underlying tissue by what we call a basement membrane. Okay. And we don't have to know the details of the basement membrane for this course, except to know that there aren't any cells in it. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's in it, but there's, there's fibers and there's matrix stuff in it. Okay. And it anchors the cells of the epithelium to, oh, look, here's a little capillary. So nutrients can go up into the epithelium. When we look at photomicrographs, here is the epithelium, here's the lumen. So that's the surface stuff is secreting. And the basement membrane we usually can see because it usually stains due to the chemicals in this acellular stuff. It usually stains quite obviously. All right. So then we classify our epithelium looking at two things. And the first thing we look at is what is the shape of the cells forming the epithelium? And we have three different cell shapes. The first are the flat cells, what we call squamous cells. So look at that. They're not squamous, they're squamous, long A, squamous cells. So these are flat, thin cells. Think of a fried egg with the yolk sticking up, okay, with the nucleus being the yolk, okay? And so that nucleus bulges a little bit. And so the white of the egg is very thin. And what this is, it's a very thin cell, so things can diffuse through it very easily. So when we want stuff to be able to cross super easily, think like gases in our lungs, we would have squamous cells. The second cell shape, think of a box in 3D, which is a cube. So these are called cuboidal cells. And here the nucleus is round and it sits in the middle of the cell. Now, cuboidal cells have the option, as in they are not required, but they may have little microvilli sitting on the surface of the cube. And so microvilli do what microvilli do, and that is increase the surface area of the cell for either absorption or secretion. So if we have cuboidal cells in a duct, then we know that they're going to either be absorbing or secreting, or they could be doing both. The third option for a cell is one that is taller than it is wide. It's shaped like a column, so it's called a columnar cell. And now the nucleus can be round, but oftentimes it is oval. And the nucleus is always in the bottom half of the cell. It's never going to be floating near the surface. It's in the bottom half of the cell, what we call the basal part of the cell. These cells can have the cilia. Do you remember what cilia do? That's right, create external currents so that stuff can move along. So we can have columnar cells in our respiratory tract to move stuff along. But columnar cells could also have microvilli for absorbing or secreting, or they might not have either of those. All right, so that's the first classification, looking at the cell shape. The second classification is how many layers of cells do we have? So if we only have one layer of cells, we call it a simple epithelium. Okay? And these are the type where we're going to have a lot of diffusion, whether it's an osmosis, diffusion of water, or diffusion of other things, gases, diffusion of sodium, diffusion of other things, or if we're going to have secreting or absorbing. Then we start counting. If we get to 2 layers, or if we get to 20 layers, or if we get to 2,000 layers, which we're never going to have. Once we get to 2 cell layers or more, we no longer use the word simple. We're going to use the word stratified. And cells are going to move from the basement membrane where they are formed, and they are going to move towards the surface. And the surface cells is the apical layer, and down at the basement membrane, that's called the basal layer. And we're going to have stratified epithelium in areas where we have abrasion. So of course your skin is going to be stratified, because if it was a simple epithelium, as soon as somebody rubbed on your skin, those cells would be gone. Okay. And so stratified epithelium is there to protect your underlying tissues. And when we have a stratified epithelium, we classify it by the shape of the apical cell. So looking at this simple epithelium, do these cells look squamous, cuboidal, or columnar? That's right. You can tell easily that this would be a simple squamous epithelium. Now, looking at this example of a stratified epithelium, when you look at it, this basal layer, they look very cuboidal. But this apical layer, they're flatter. So they're not completely flat like up here, but they're much flatter. They're not cuboidal. So this would be an example of a stratified squamous epithelium, as not a stratified cuboidal epithelium. But then there is a third classification, and it's one that at first glance you think is stratified, but it's not really. So we call it pseudostratified epithelium. It's a single layer that appears to be. So it has nuclei that are at multiple layers, but as opposed to stratified epithelium where you see nuclei at this layer, and then nuclei at this layer, and then nuclei at this layer. As stratified, it's not all nuclei at this layer, then all nuclei at this layer, then all nuclei at this layer. It's like, okay, so we've got some here, we've got some higher up, and we've got some higher up, and we've got some lower down. It's kind of like we've got some at all these different layers, rather than every cell at this layer, and every cell at this layer, and every cell at this layer. And that's your clue that it's pseudo-stratified. There's a couple other clues. Pseudo-stratified is always ciliated. Okay. Now, simple and stratified can be ciliated, but they don't have to be. But pseudostratified must be ciliated. And pseudostratified is going to have these cells called goblet cells. So it looks kind of like this champagne glass. Do you see that? With no nucleus in it. And it's filled with this amorphous stuff, which is mucus stuff. It's a single cell that secretes this mucousy stuff. It's a single cell gland, a gland that's a single cell. You can see here they've drawn in two of them. Okay, so other epithelium can have them, but pseudostratified must have cilia and must have these goblet cells. All right, so those are the two things. So realizing when we're looking at tissues, things aren't always perfectly square, okay? So yes, when we have cross sections and it's perfect, it looks like this. And when we have perfect longitudinals, it's gonna look like this, and you're gonna see a ductus like this. But remember, sometimes things are cut on angles and they're not gonna be looking perfect, okay? So just realize that when you're looking at pictures, they're not always going to be lined up exactly like this or exactly like this. Things can be at angle. You're just looking for a surface. And if there is a surface, it is epithelium. All right, that's it for this section. And I will come back and I will show you examples putting the two classifications together, how we get our different types of epithelium. See you shortly as we continue this topic.